Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the book, When You Hear Hoofbeats, Think of a Zebra, the author Shams Friedlander narrates a compelling story about a farmer in Anatolia who had a wife and a young son. Now, the farmer's wife was always complaining about how poor they were, how little they had. She complained about needing a new roof and how the barn had broken down and how they didn't even have a horse to help with the plowing. One morning, as the farmer and his son made their way into the fields, they noticed a beautiful white horse. A horse with perfect proportions, standing under a tree, glistening in the sunlight. They went up to it and started to feed it. The wife came running out, and rather than being happy for actually having a horse, she said, "Look for markings. This must be a rich man's horse." But no markings could be found. "Well, we can sell this horse, and with the money we make, we can fix the roof, we can buy a wagon, we can rebuild the barn, and we'll even have money left over for our old age." The farmer stepped back. "I won't sell this horse," he said to her. "Well, if you don't, I will leave you," said the wife. Now, you see, the farmer was considered by his wife, as well as the local townspeople, as becoming more and more odd over the years, because whatever happened in his life, whether it was good or bad, he would simply say, maybe it's a blessing, maybe it's a curse. Only Allah knows. And whatever befell him, that's what he'd say. Now, the next morning, the farmer started to build an enclosure for the horse, and this really irritated the wife. And so she went off to her sister's house down the road, leaving him behind. The farmer simply shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe it's a blessing, maybe it's a curse. Only Allah knows. Now, news of this beautiful horse traveled from village to village until the Sultan came to hear of it. And he called his lieutenant to go to the farmer and to offer him a bag of gold for the horse, telling him that if he wasn't willing to sell it, then to kill him and to capture the horse and bring it back to the Sultan. The lieutenant did as he was told, and he pleaded with the farmer to sell him the horse, but the farmer would simply not budge. "My orders are to kill you and to take the horse if you won't sell it to me. This will be your death," said the lieutenant. "Maybe it's a blessing. Maybe it's a curse. Only Allah knows," replied the farmer. The lieutenant asked the farmer to reconsider and that he would return in a few days' time. Now, in the meantime, townspeople started to gather around this farmer and began to argue with him, telling him that he was making a mistake. But the farmer continued to follow his heart. He just simply submitted his fate to the divine will. That very evening, the farmer's young son decided to ride the horse in the fields. And on his journey in the dark, the horse suddenly stepped into a hole, throwing the boy high into the air. Falling, the boy broke both his legs. The townspeople found him in time and carried him home. "You didn't listen to us," they said to the farmer. "If only you'd sold that horse, your son would never have broken his legs." "Maybe it's a blessing. Maybe it's a curse. Only Allah knows," he replied. The next day, a war broke out. The Sultan's lieutenant never returned, and all the young boys of the village were called into the army, except for the farmer's son, because of his injuries. "You're so lucky," said the townspeople. "We will never be able to see our sons again, but you at least have your son with you." Don't you understand? Replied the farmer. Maybe it's a blessing. Maybe it's a curse. Only Allah knows. Because for him, it was always about wholeheartedly submitting his fate to the divine will of Allah, come what may. You know, in reflecting on this story, the author poses the question, why is it that every time we hear hoofbeats, we think of a horse? And the answer is because we've been conditioned. And in that conditioning, we've fallen asleep, he says. And in that state of sleep, we have forgotten Allah. And in that moment of forgetting Allah, we are capable of doing anything. But when we are in the state of remembering Allah, in that moment, we can only ever do good. You know, this farmer always remembered Allah. He always submitted to the divine will of Allah. And in that state, every decision he made, albeit in the short term, might have given him pain and suffering. In the long term, every decision he made was always in his benefit. You see, each one of us experiences pain and suffering in our lives. No one's life is perfect. And even if it may appear to be that way through social media, Instagram, and so on, no one's life is perfect. No one has everything, because having everything would imply that dependence on Allah is no longer necessary. And whether we realize our dependence on Allah or not, it surely exists. Now, in a shairi attributed to Nida Fazli, the poet says, "Kabhi kisi ko mukammal jahan nahi milta, kahin zameen to kahin asman nahi milta." Nobody gets everything in life. Some don't get the earth, others can't reach the sky. And it is this idea of not having everything that can remind us of our dependence and our reliance on Allah, inviting us to remember him, to have God consciousness, taqwa, and to submit to his divine will, everything that is beyond our control. And this is important. It's so important. It is so very important. Tonight, we commemorate Laylatul Qadr, the night that our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam received his first revelation from Allah. It marked the beginning of his prophethood and the revelation of Islam as Allah's final message. But this night also commemorates the Prophet's submission to the divine will. You know, whilst deep in reflection and in contemplation, having retreated from the chaos of Meccan life, it was in the stillness of the night within the cave of Hira that, according to Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulillah, the angel Jibrail brought Allah's message to the Prophet. And whilst the Prophet was, of course, seemingly perplexed, ultimately, his total submission to Allah's will guided him in the work he was to do as the final prophet of Allah. Surah Al-Dukhan, Ayah 3, refers to this night as Laylatul Mubarakati, the blessed night, on which Allah bestows upon us his infinite grace and mercy. Allah says in Surah Al-Qadr of the Quran,
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر وما أدراك ما ليلة القدر ليلة القدر خير من 1000 شهر تنزل الملائكة والروح فيها بإذن ربهم من كل أمر سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر.
Now, if 1,000 months were to signify eternity, then this is a reminder of our spiritual destiny, of seeking out the light and in searching for the haqiqah, the truth, through which we are able to transcend the mundane, physical aspects of life as our lives take on a new meaning. And through this transcendence, our thoughts, our actions, our goals, our aspirations, they can begin to become aligned with the divine will of Allah. And it is on this night that we are reminded to focus in on that alignment. But why is it so important to align our thoughts, our actions, our goals, our aspirations with the divine will of Allah? What is the purpose of this God consciousness, and why do we give it such prominence in our thoughts, particularly on this special night? In a speech made at the Evora University Symposium in 2006, Maulana Hazar Imam said, in the ethical realm, as in the educational realm, one of the great stumbling blocks is arrogance. Even the resurgence of religious feeling, which should be such a positive force, can become a negative influence when it turns into self-righteousness. All of the world's great religions warn against this excess, yet in the name of those same religions, too many are tempted to play God themselves rather than recognizing their humility before the divine. If we were to unpack this, arrogance, whether stemming through our own knowledge, our education, our religious beliefs, or even through our general day-to-day lives, through our experiences, could be understood as a quality that is in direct contradiction to being mindful of God, of this God consciousness. After all, if we are arrogant to the point that we consider ourselves to be self-righteous or playing God, then we are in essence forgetting the very nature of God, of our reliance and our dependence on him, and on our need for him to provide for our sustenance. In other words, if we begin to believe that we create through our own being, rather than having been created or having been inspired to create what little we do create, then we cannot submit to the divine will. And as the author Friedlander explains, we are then capable of anything, whether that is good or bad. But if we recognize our humility before the divine, and we accept our reliance and our need for Allah and his guidance, then we will surely be guided to only do good. In a sense, we then become the instruments through which Allah works, and our actions, our ethics, our goals are guided by the light of Allah. Of course, our own free will is there. The ability to use our intellect is there, but it can be inspired by that light. And when this happens, we are able to draw closer and closer and closer in our search for the divine. And through our ibadat and remembrance or zikr, that link becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. Tonight is the night for us to heighten our awareness of this ambition through the example of the Prophet, and to remind us that with the ability for all of our shortcomings to be forgiven on this night, the blessings and barakah of Laylatul Qadr can surely springboard us into an awakened awareness of our spiritual destiny. Ibn Rushd, the great 12th century Muslim philosopher, categorized search for the divine through two types of experiences. One, through the manifestation of the divine in the form of creation, which we can experience through our senses, and the other through directly experiencing the divine, the light itself. And so, in the chaos and noise of our daily lives, let's not forget nor forsake this search for that light. A search which is strengthened through the good we are guided to do, through our interactions with creation, through our actions and behavior towards each other, through how we positively engage with the environment around us, and of course, through our yearning of experiencing the divine itself. Zikr, reflection, communal worship, personal prayer, ethical conduct, and submission to the divine will are all ways in which we can draw closer to directly experiencing the divine, the light itself, an ambition we should always aspire towards. As in the words attributed to the famous 13th century Persian poet Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, "Didn't I tell you, do not leave me, for I am your only friend. I am the spring of life. Even if you leave in anger for thousands of years, you will come back to me, for I am your goal and I am your end." And as we continue on our spiritual journey to reach this goal, to reach this end, as we continue to search for that enlightenment tonight and beyond, and as we reflect on what we have just explored about the very nature and benefit of submitting to the divine will and to constantly be mindful of Allah's presence in our lives, let us conclude with a prayer, which, whilst many of us may have heard before, can be particularly elevating when recited on this very night. A prayer which, according to several hadith, is attributed to our beloved Prophet. O Allah, place light in my heart, and on my tongue light, and in my ears light, and in my sight light, and above me light, and below me light, and to my right light, and to my left light, and before me light, and behind me light. Place in my soul light, magnify for me light, amplify for me light, make for me light, make me light.